Now, good afternoon, Ms Trina.
Good afternoon, my lord. The next witness is going to be Sarah Jane Cruz. She's from Partners in Advocacy.
Good afternoon, Ms Cruz.
Good afternoon.
Right, you're going to be asked some questions. On you go, Ms Trina.
Thank you. I wonder if you could begin perhaps by confirming your name and the role that you currently have.
Yeah, of course. Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Jane Cruz. I work for Partners in Advocacy as a services manager in their children and young persons sector.
You have kindly provided the inquiry with two previous statements, I think, the first of which is in relation to matters which pertain to education,
Yes.
which have already been covered, and you've provided a further statement in relation to issues relating to justice.
Yes.
That statement, for our records, bears the reference SCI WT 0687 and then a number 1. We have your statement up in order to hopefully aid you in giving your evidence today. We are going to touch on a number of matters which are contained within it, with a focus on the services that the service provides to children and young people. You touch, I think, on other adult services within the statement as well, so rest assured those will be considered and are before the inquiry. First of all, at paragraph 7 of your statement, you tell us a bit about the organisation. Can I start by asking you, what is Partners in Advocacy?
Of course. So Partners in Advocacy is an independent Scottish advocacy organisation. We follow the rules of the Scottish Independent Advocacy Alliance. Our organisation supports multiple different people across Scotland. We have nationwide services, we have local authority services, and what we do is we support people going through processes or issues to have their rights respected and views heard, and we do that through our independent advocacy workers.
In your statement, I think you tell us that at the time of the pandemic, the organisation had 30 independent advocacy workers, is that right?
Yeah, around about 30, and we've grown since then.
I think you tell us it's now increased to 35.
35, with also more support and structure around. From the time of the pandemic, the organisation has grown exponentially, introducing our children's hearing service and needing the management and advocates to run that service. We've also welcomed a service in the Highlands and some drug and alcohol services in the Highlands, as well as some more specialist services to our organisation, so they could be like, say, secure care services or residential services that we have added in our advocates. We've needed to grow to provide the work there.
What are the aims and objectives of the organisation?
So our aims and objectives are to make sure that all people are heard in matters that are impacting them. So, you know, whether it's adults going through mental health tribunals, young people going through mental health tribunals, young people going through children's hearings, all of these things are massive within people's lives, and we want to make sure that they are considered in all aspects of the proceedings, that they know their rights, that their rights are upheld, and that they have a say in the matters that are affecting them. And we want to make sure all people of any age, any gender, ethnicity, all are heard in the matters that are affecting them. And so that's what we aim to do, is to communicate and to make sure people's rights are upheld.
As part of your role within the organisation, what are the kind of duties that you hold?
So I'm a services manager. I currently manage multiple services. I manage our nationwide education service. I manage a Glasgow mental health service, a service in Dundee that supports mental health within young people, but also broader in the wider community, so issues such as young parents, isolation, things like that. And I also manage our branch of specialist services, which include a secure care service, a step-down service, 3 or 4 different residential services, and 2 specialist school services as well. So there's a broad range of kind of individual projects or services, if you like, that I look after and support the advocates and be able to support the young people who access the services.
Thank you very much for everybody's attention and waiting. And thank you very much, Sarah Jane. My next questions for you relate to really the role of an advocacy worker in the processes that you've been talking about. Can you tell us what are some of the duties that an advocacy worker adheres to when they're conducting their work?
Yeah, so our work really starts like right at the start. So when we have a referral come into us, one of the questions we first ask on a referral is, do you know, interest of the young person and background. Our role is really important that we build up a relationship with a young person, and so we start that, you know, right at the beginning. The point in that is that an independent advocate is someone completely different to a young person, and they might not have experienced that in their life before. We are completely independent of the process going around. We can't be beholden to, you know, what a parent wants, what a teacher wants, what a panel member wants. We're simply there for the young person, and we need to build up trust and relationships with that young person. And to do that, we take an interest in what their likes and dislikes are. We tailor our service to every single individual young person. So, for example, say a young person is really keen on, you know, football. It might be that, you know, for the first initial couple of visits until that young person is comfortable with us, you know, we kick about a ball with them in the garden, or, you know, we go for walks with a young person to make it easier to talk. We build that relationship, and we explain that we are a separate entity from what's going on, and the building of that trust and us being an individual with that young person can allow a young person to speak to us more freely. We have confidentiality rules for our young people, that everything they tell us stays in complete confidence unless it breaches child protection. And so the young person then gets to be in the driver's seat as to when information is shared and what information it is they like to be, what they want to be shared, as well as advising them of their rights. So that could be a young person working with us for, say, if they're coming up to a hearing, it could be that we get that referral in, we like it as soon as possible so that we can start building that relationship, and we work up to building views over a period of time. But the young person gets to say, actually, do you know, I don't want that bit in, or can we really emphasise that? They're in complete control of that. And then we would support the young person if they wanted to attend a meeting or attend a hearing or attend a tribunal, wherever it was the issues were being heard and decisions were being made. We can stop a hearing or proceeding if the young person feels overwhelmed and ask for a couple of minutes for them. We're there to be their support. How I explain it to someone new at times is that if you can imagine you're going to, say, a school meeting, and you know you've maybe got your parents there who think that they know the right path. You've got your guidance teacher that thinks they know the right path. You might have a pastoral care teacher that thinks they know the right path, maybe a social worker or others involved. They all have a wealth of experience and knowledge. We're not denying that at all, but sometimes that young person's voice can be lost, and how overwhelming would it be to speak up and say, actually, what you're saying to me isn't going to work for me because of X, Y and Z reasons. And so having an advocate there and someone who's just for that young person is incredibly powerful, because the young person can go, actually, you know, can you tell them that that's not what's needed, or this is what I'm feeling. We never make, as advocates, promises to get the young person what they want, but we do say that their views will be heard in the way that they want them to be. And then we can support that young person in understanding the decisions that have been made at the end of the process, and make sure, and if there's any other avenues to explore, then we can support the young person in doing that as well.
There may be situations where a child or young person also has legal representation in the form of a solicitor attending some of either these meetings or tribunals or hearings. How are your views distinct from that of a legal representative?
So we're not there from a legal point of view. Our advocates don't have a legal expertise. The legal expert will be the legal expert. We don't have to work in best interest for a young person. You know, it doesn't need to be what would be best for that child. It's just the young person's views, and that can sometimes be very different from, you know, what others would want for that young person. When we work in conjunction with legal personnel, then we are very much still, you know, we can break things down. So say we're working with a legal personnel and they're explaining the process to the young person, we can sometimes break that process down, and as we get to know the child or young person, you know, we will understand a little bit more about how they communicate and what their needs are, so we can sometimes break things down. But for us, it will always come down to that child or young person's choice and their views.
You tell us within your statement, I think, that the service has around 12 children and young people specific services which happen, I think, across different locations. You tell us first there's support available for things like children's hearings.
Yeah.
Then also I think you say that you support children in residential settings, like children's care, residential care homes. You also mention, I think, that you work within St Mary's Kenmure in their secure setting.
Yes.
Can you tell me a bit about that work?
Yeah, so we started working with St Mary's almost 4 years ago, and we are the independent advocates for any young person who resides within St Mary's. It's work we're really proud of. These are some of the most vulnerable children and young people that we come across. We have 2 advocates working that service at the moment, and they support any young person within St Mary's with either going through children's hearings, or if they're cross-border young people, so young people who come up from a different placement outside of Scotland, then we support them with, you know, their secure accommodation reviews. We support young people with how they feel within their placement at St Mary's. We have recently set up a group within St Mary's that the young people are in charge of, and it's more like a collective advocacy. It's called Young People's Council, we call it YPC. The young people are entirely in charge of that, and we support young people to have their views on their care, on their housing situation, you know, whether they want more you know, plants or towels, or, you know, getting their meals right for them, and we support young people with the little things that end up being really big things, like not getting the right meals, or not having the right gym equipment, or not having the right, you know, support while they're in there, as well as the bigger things such as hearings and appearances. And it's really important work, because these are really important young people that we need to get things right for.
I think you also tell us within your statement, in terms of the cover of the organisation, you provide advocacy, particularly in relation to children's hearings, in 7 of 32 local authorities in Scotland. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So, as I said, I don't manage that service directly, but my colleague does, and we've provided that service for, again, that'll be coming up on, should be 4 years, 4 years this year, and we provide support to any young person as per the legislation who is going through a children's hearings, to help them understand the grounds, to make sure they're comfortable, to feed back into that. And that's where the kind of things that I talked about previously kind of come into play, that we don't work in best interest. So say, for example, a young person has a view that they want to return home, but that might not be in their best interest. They still have the right to be heard on that. And so we will voice that view for them. It might not be the decision that the panel then make, but we respect and recognise their right to be heard on that, and to make sure that view is voiced.
You mentioned there, I think, a statutory requirement. We've heard already evidence to the inquiry that there are situations in which advocacy services have to be offered to the people who are subject to those proceedings. One of those, I think, is children's hearings. Is that right?
Yeah.
And for that aspect of it, those mandatory services that are required, the advocacy services are funded by the Scottish Government. Is that right?
Yes, so Scottish Government funds 2 of our statutory services. The other 2 are funded by health boards or local authorities.
I want to ask you now about the effect of the pandemic on the way that the service operates. But in order to do that, I think I first need to ask you how children and young people accessed the service and how you engaged with them before the pandemic.
Yeah, so before the pandemic, everything was done face-to-face. And we as an organisation, before the pandemic happened, started to question that a little bit due to a couple of cases where young people absolutely wanted to meet with their advocacy worker, but face-to-face felt too intense. But what I was describing earlier about, getting it right for each young person as an individual, everything was face-to-face before the pandemic. We would go out to young people's homes or hospitals if they're in hospital. We would go out to local cafes, anywhere where the young person felt comfortable. And again, the choice for that was down to the young person, but it was absolutely all face-to-face and engaging with the young person, because that was thought that was the best way to do that. And for some young people it absolutely is, and for others, as we'll go on to talk about, I think then that there's alternate methods that work for other young people kind of better, if you like. It's more their preference.
Effectively, alternate methods, I think, were forced upon you by some of the restrictions that were implemented in March of 2020. And you say, particularly in your statement, that it really changed the entire way that advocacy services were delivered. What changes did you have to make immediately to the services?
We had to rethink everything. When the majority of your work is face to face, and that's no longer an option, given that some of our services we operate nationally, some of our services our workers work in one local authority and go to another. That became an issue later on, but there wasn't that face to face contact. We had young people who had hearings kind of upcoming. We had things that we had to immediately kind of alter to be able to support them. So that was things like face-to-face appointments were all cancelled. We had to get in touch with young people via virtual means. I think everybody very quickly had to get to grips with Teams and video calling, text messaging. We had to try alternate ways of communicating. And that for us, to start with, was a little bit more difficult, because some of our children and young people, as I've already highlighted, are quite vulnerable. And some of our young people in different projects at different times were experiencing, poverty. There could have been issues where, we weren't able to get in touch because their phone had been cut off or they didn't have internet access. And there was things like that to consider. So we had to really try and think outside of the box to, send letters with envelopes in with kind of stamps on them in case someone couldn't afford to return a letter if they weren't answering phone calls. We had to adapt our whole way of being to suit the needs of our advocacy partners, given the kind of constraints that were in place at the time due to COVID rules. For ourselves as an organisation, we had to obviously comply with all of this guidance that was given to make sure everybody was safe. We used to work predominantly from offices altogether. Everybody was working from home. There was, considerations for people working from home, like if you had, say, a family and you're trying to do work. Our work, as I said before, is confidential. So, there could be real issues around that, creating a safe space. And that was also true in the opposite end, getting into discussions with advocacy partners where, there could be 3 other children at home potentially, and you're working with one of the children. The confidence at that side could be difficult to navigate, to make sure that they were able to say what they wanted to say. And so a lot changed for us, and we had to develop and think quite quickly on what our new best practice would be in the kind of virtual world of advocacy.
There's a lot of things there which I think I want to further explore with you.
Course.
But first of all, I think stay in your statement that in terms of the support that you were giving at the time the pandemic begun, you were supporting around 40 children and young people at that time. Is that right?
The statement regards to one particular service, which was the education service, which is in the previous statement, and that's not been. So there would have been more children supported at one time throughout the other projects, but that was our education specialist project. There was 40 young people supported at one time. If I had to kind of estimate the services that we had at the time, I would say we were probably supporting around 70, 80 young people at the time that the pandemic commenced.
And you spoke there about there having to be, of course, a necessary change in the ways that you were going to engage with them because face-to-face meetings simply weren't possible. Were there particular methods of communication which young people enjoyed and benefited from at that time?
Yeah, especially in our education service, because one of the statutes that's in law is for our education project, a young person with additional support needs has to know what it is they're asking for. So some of our young people are quite capable in terms of knowing what it is they're asking for in their education. We very quickly learned that some young people were being really, really polite, and when their advocacy workers were going out face to face prior to the pandemic, and sitting engaging with them, that those were far longer meetings than the young people wanted them to be. And so when we moved to virtual or texting or video calls, then the young person was like, well, actually, I've given you all I want to say in those meetings, maybe cut down from an hour long to I've given you your instructions in 10, 15 minutes. And so some young people reported back that virtual worked much better for them and it felt better for them, and for others it wasn't as effective.
You mentioned there text communication. I think you say in your statement that was popular among a kind of teenage demographic,
yeah,
and particularly popular among a female teenage demographic.
Yeah.
I wondered, can you tell us why you think text communication, particularly for teenagers, was something that they felt comfortable in using? Yeah,
I think it gave the young people the ownership over their advocacy. Young people are always kind of in control, but when we were going out face to face, there would also be an element of admin that would potentially need to go through parents to organise what day was best to go out, etc. Being able to text your advocate and communicate back and forth on your own time, with your own thoughts, with your own views, was really helpful for some. Other young people chose text over kind of virtual means such as like calls, video calls, because of self-esteem issues. Others chose it because it's their natural way of communicating, text messaging to friends, and actually it was easier for them to feel like they could express what it was. We incorporate whatever way works best for a young person, but we have an advocate now who has a young person who will communicate via text only, and they set up a window. So say Wednesday between 4 and 5, they will have a chat via text, and both of them will be there to respond to one another's message. It's really about us getting it right for what suits each individual young person.
You also mentioned, I think, that there was difficulties in terms of knowing who might be privy to the conversations that were happening, and the conversations specifically being very confidential and personal in nature. What were some of the issues you encountered with that?
So I think I alluded to earlier, it could be really difficult to get a confidential space when everyone's at home. So a young person might have other family members at home. They might be only able to communicate in one area of the house where the Wi-Fi is best. That might be the kitchen, which is a communal kind of space. There was issues regarding whether that young person felt is free and able to share those views as they would be on a one-to-one in a different location. There's also the hustle and bustle of daily life, and with everybody being at home and everyone going through this experience that was new to everyone, kind of sorting out where young people could talk if there was a good time. It became a little bit more difficult just to ensure that a young person was able to kind of communicate effectively. And we did look at that within Partners in Advocacy, and it was slightly easier with young people that we'd worked with before the pandemic, because you get a sense of their personality, and if you got a sense that maybe they weren't as bubbly, or they weren't communicating in a way that was normal for that young person, then you could maybe follow up later with a text just saying, just checking that you're all right, or was there anything else you wanted to share? But it was increasingly difficult for young people who were newly referred to us through the pandemic to get that sense, because you have to do the work building the relationship first. And we absolutely did do that, and we got to a point where we were able to kind of tell if a young person wasn't able to share, but it was individual to each young person.
We've heard today evidence in relation to children's hearings taking place, and there being quite significant changes to the processes of children's hearings at that time. We've also heard that advocacy services are heavily involved in supporting children throughout that process and helping them to engage with that process. Prior to the pandemic, how were you able to physically go to those hearings and provide support?
Yeah, so our children's hearing service provision came on through the pandemic. That was a part of our organisational growth. But previous to that, in different services where we were able to, absolutely, we would go and support young people at those hearings. And the pandemic brought change to that, to particularly vulnerable young people who, as I kind of alluded to earlier, who can ask their advocacy worker to stop the proceedings, to a virtual world where it was far more difficult for them to feel heard and to feel supported. Advocacy, we adapted as quickly as we could to the remote delivery, and while that allowed, a continuation of the service, there was barriers there for young people who weren't able to engage virtually. And again, as we just talked about, that was particularly difficult for if a conversation really had to be strictly confidential, or there was views that a young person was maybe, what's the word I want to use, maybe it wasn't the right environment for them to share that views. There could be someone listening in. There might have been views that we would have treated in kind of the strictest confidence previous to that couldn't happen because everyone was at home. So it was increasingly difficult.
We have heard that today that there was a period where children were not able to participate in children's hearings. And then later on there were children's hearings which were arranged online, in which they participated in online. As far as you're aware, what were children and young people reporting to you about how they felt with those changes happening?
I think the main things are that isolation and disconnection. The whole point in advocacy is to allow young people to empower themselves, and not being able to participate in decisions being made without being present and without being considered is the exact opposite of what we, what should be happening, what we aim to be able to let young people empower themselves and be a part of the process. It's massive in the adaptations that young people had to make all over Scotland for numerous reasons, but when we look at this, these are some of the most vulnerable young people, and further isolation, further not being able to be involved was really, really difficult.
You mentioned, I think, in your statement that at times the environment to some children and young people felt quite daunting and quite impersonal.
Yeah.
How did that affect their participation?
Yeah, I guess it's like anything. If you're feeling worried about something and something is daunting, you want to kind of shy away from that. And when we work with young people, we, as I say, try and make it as easy for them as possible. So, again, prior and post COVID, there'll be occasions where you can prepare your young person, you can take them to see the hearing suite, you can let them know what's going to happen, before what will be likely to happen. You can go through their views and you can prepare in a really meaningful way. But that daunting and impersonal kind of take on it that happened through COVID, and we understand why it had to happen. It was tough for these children, and we need to remember that the experience of trauma, a lot of these young people have already went through that experience of trauma, and that was really, really difficult for them to then not feel connected, not feel prepared, and to feel further negative emotions.
You also mentioned within your statement at least some experience of occasions where advocacy workers weren't able to join children's hearings in order to provide support. How did that affect how the hearing went and how the young person felt about the hearing?
Yeah, when on the occasions where they weren't able to join, you know, there could be links that have gone missing, or you know, things happen. However, the impact on the young person, especially if you've been working with a young person to share their views and then not to be able to do that, it's that distrust and it's that isolation. You know, you've been working with a young person for a purpose, and to support them in something that's really big within their lives, and for an advocate not be able to fulfil what they're there to do, it also means that that young person's rights haven't been upheld in that process because their views haven't been shared, they haven't been, you know, considered, or not that we've seen, and that was, for our young people, really difficult.
Another thing, or another issue that you narrate within the statement, is the delay or postponement of hearings and court proceedings in relation to children and young people. What effect did that have as far as your service experience?
Yeah, I think if you're working towards something, you know, there's increased frustration, there's increased upset, because you're working towards, for that young person, them having an answer. It's a daunting process, as much as we, you know, explain rights and make sure a young person is as comfortable as they can be. You can't always take away that anxiety that sits with a young person, and so the delay, postponement, and not getting the answer that they're wanting at that particular time did cause, you know, issues to a young person's emotional well-being.
You tell us, I think, within the statement that throughout the pandemic there were, of course, increasing demands on staff, and that caused an anxiety and a pressure. But you also tell us that throughout the pandemic and since, that demand for the service itself has increased. I wonder if you know why that is, why more people are trying to access advocacy services. I
think the demand has increased because of the nature. I mean, there's multiple factors to that. The incorporation of UNCRC now, people are recognising young people's rights more and more, which is amazing. But also there's long-lasting issues. If we look at ongoing things with young people's mental health, young people's education, young people's experience with hearings, there's more demand for services because there's more things, or I think there's more emphasis on rights and what young people are entitled to, and when things aren't going right, they're aware that they have the right to be able to access services like ourselves to be able to support them through those processes. But I also do believe that with the referrals that we've been receiving, there's a mental health impact from the multiple sources, but the pandemic is one of them for sure. The young people that were out of education are not able to contribute to hearings. There's lasting impacts there from young people that have been vulnerable, and has then led to emotional wellbeing issues.
All of this has a necessary impact on the people who are trying to deliver the service at what was obviously a challenging time. Your statement tells us that this key worker status of advocacy workers was something which was perhaps not consistent across Scotland. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, so in some places, key worker status was given, but there was issues in how that was practiced kind of across Scotland. Obviously, we had to comply with the guidance at the time, and the guidance obviously fluctuated. So, for example, we were key workers and offered early vaccinations. However, some of our workers were outside of, say Glasgow, where the immunisations were happening, and it was a little bit kind of, are we allowed to travel to get the vaccinations if it was travel within kind of local authorities. There was also varying degrees of how advocates were seen in kind of statutory services and institutions. So, for example, we had great relationships with a few local authorities and were given, PPE, and they understood the role. And then there was other local authorities who, when we were allowed out and about and to visit face to face, who were questioning the need for advocacy to be there and didn't recognise key worker and had to limit, especially amongst kind of hospital settings and things like that. So there was a varying degree of success with key worker status, and for us when we were able to, we still worked for the majority of the time virtually while the pandemic was progressing. Even when face-to-face was allowed, we had to protect our staff and do risk assessments for, it would be if you were out 1 week, it would be one visit and then making sure that the person tested and that we weren't then bringing COVID into another vulnerable individual the next day. We had to be really careful around that, but there was still kind of constraints around the people who needed us face to face, getting to see them even when the restrictions allowed us to do so.
I think you tell us in your statement that the organisation mandated the use of masks when face-to-face meetings then started to occur. Particularly in meeting with children and young people, how did the wearing of masks impact on that interaction?
Yeah, there was a few things that was difficult with children and young people with the kind of mandatory safety requirements. So, social distancing, meeting, and when we went back out to meet, it was masks, and we had to be socially distanced. And potentially, if a young person had a garden, there would be, and young people, when they built that relationship, don't want that distance. It made it hard for young people who have additional support needs and who want to see the whole face, or who lip read, or who just want to see that friendly face. So it was increasingly difficult again.
With all of the issues and challenges that we've spoken about, was staff morale impacted at all?
We tried to support staff as best we could. Obviously, it was an incredibly worrying time for everyone all over. We'd never been through anything like this before. We focused a lot of our energies into staff wellbeing. Being an advocacy worker is a tough job at the best of times. You're seeing really vulnerable young people, and they can be asking for things that's potentially not for the good, and you need to be able to go forward and to do that. We can be challenged quite often about our usefulness, or with whether we've went back and explained things to young people properly. It's an incredibly challenging job at the best of times, but we have a culture within Partners in Advocacy of doing our utmost to look after our staff, because we recognise that through the pandemic we just stepped up. We made sure that all of our staff were aware of our wellbeing policies, that they had access to things that would support them, our confidential counselling service, and our managers did check-ins daily to make sure that people were okay. It was a really kind of person-centred approach to our advocates as well as to our young people, and we did the best that we could. But obviously it was a very frightening and emotional time for all, because that, on this scale, it had never been seen before.
At the end of your statement, you kindly provide us with some reflections about lessons to be learned and insight into what the organisation thinks are really the key takeaways from what you experienced. And one of the things that you say is that really vulnerable and potentially marginalised individuals who are the people who require independent advocacy were disproportionately impacted by some of the restrictions and then some of the processes which took place. And I wondered, with the benefit of hindsight, is there anything you think that can be done in future in order to improve the way that we deal with those types of people if another unexpected event were to happen?
Yeah, I think what you guys are doing just now, we need to learn from it, and we need to be prepared for if anything should happen again. we need contingency plans. We need to base on our learning of what our young people have went through during the COVID period, and look to see how that can be minimised in the future, and to make sure that our young people really are as protected as they can be.
Thank you, Sarah Jane. I don't have any further questions for you. It just goes for me to thank you for spending the time today with us, and I wonder if His Lordship has anything to ask.
No, thank you. Thank you, Ms Trainer, and thank you, Ms Gross. Very grateful. 2:45.
Yes, thank you.
No. Good afternoon, Mr Turner.
Good afternoon, my Lord. The final panel that we have today, my Lord, is from Children's Hearing Scotland panel members.
Good. No, good afternoon to you all.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
No, Mr Turner, I suspect, has some questions for you.
Thank you, my Lord. Good afternoon. Before I begin, just a reminder that we are being transcribed today, so if we can try and speak as slowly and as clearly as possible, try not to follow me, and we'll do fine. If I could, first of all, ask each of you just to give His Lordship your full name and perhaps just what your current role or roles, I think as many of you have, with Children's Hearing Scotland is. And if there was any other roles that you were undertaking during the pandemic, perhaps you could also mention those to His Lordship. Mr King, could I start first with you?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Jack King. During the time of the COVID and inquiry, I was lead panel representative in Edinburgh, fully responsible for all rota management and deputising for the area convener in Edinburgh, as we didn't have an active deputy area convener at that time. I also facilitated for the Learning Academy and did some work on the introduction of our new digital platforms.
Thank you. And Mrs Young?
Yes, I was a panel member throughout the pandemic, but I was also a lead panel representative in West Lothian for much of the period of the pandemic, and for the latter part of the pandemic I was also the area convener for Central and West Lothian, which covers Falkirk, Clackmannan, Shire, Stirling and West Lothian. I also facilitate for the Learning Academy, so I've had many roles.
Thank you. And Ms Christie, finally.
Hey, my name's Susan Christie. I've been a panel member for about 6 years, nearly 7 years. Currently a panel member and a facilitator for the Learning Academy, helping with deliver the training. During the pandemic, I was a member of the area support team with a specific remit to support new panel members in their role, through their training and in their role.
Thank you. I'm going to come around you again very briefly as another part of our introduction, if I could do that. I wonder if you could just give His Lordship very briefly, I'm not looking for a full CV by any means, but very briefly just a few lines perhaps about your background and why you became panel members. Again, Mr King, if I could ask you first of all.
Thank you. I spent 40 years in financial services, worked for one of the Edinburgh leading companies, Scottish Widows, before I retired. And I became a panel member when I did retire. And the reason I became a panel member, and I'll keep this as succinct as possible, I've got 3 children. My last child is autistic. And I appreciated then, having an autistic child, how hard it was for families who had children with learning disabilities, the effect that has the family as a unit, and how difficult it is in Scotland to get the support, help and encouragement if you have a child with learning difficulties. And I think I'm an educated person and could work my way around the system. I found the system extremely hard.
Thank you. Mrs Young.
I think if anything could be said about my background, it's largely been in and out of various forms of education. The reason I became a panel member, which was 20 years ago, very simply, was that a friend said that they thought I would that I had the skills and understanding to be a panel member. So I thought about it seriously. But I think the reason, fundamentally, is that throughout my life experience and my early upbringing, that I think have always been given cause to think about whatever it is that happens to any child, good or otherwise, impacts all of us. It matters, therefore, to all of us. And because of that, I think, because I perhaps may have some skills and I have the ability to be part of this system, then I would hope that if I can make a small difference to just one child, that is worth it. And that is why I continue to be a panel member.
Thank you, Mrs Young. Ms Christie.
I would say my employment sort of after having children was very much based on supporting disadvantaged families. And through that work, I was brought to the other side of the children's panel table. And I think I was quite struck by the sort of imbalance that was there, that families were often there and they didn't really understand why they were there or what the process was. And for that reason, I think it sort of drove me on to become involved, to get a better understanding for the families that I worked with, but also for myself, so that I could, support them better, but also to, I maybe naively thought, maybe influence some change within the children's hearing system, that, it wasn't always about what you had or you didn't have. There was lots that went on in between. So that was really my sort of driving force for going for it.
Thank you. His Lordship has earlier today heard from witnesses on behalf of Children's Hearing Scotland and on behalf of the Scottish Children's Reporters Administration. So he's already heard quite a lot of background evidence. That's obviously provided his Lordship, if he needed one, an introduction to panel members. But the inquiry is keen to hear directly the experiences and the impact upon you as members directly. One of the greatest changes which we heard about in terms of the arrangements that was made was the move to remote hearings. Mr. King, I wonder if you could tell us what your experience was in terms of, I think, what you've previously termed the digital rollout of remote hearings.
Yes, it was something no panel member in Scotland, considering we've got over 2,000 of them, have had any experience of digital hearings prior to the COVID outbreak. Many of them were at different skill sets in terms of their ability to use equipment like a laptop or a computer. Many of them didn't even have a basic laptop or computer as well, and that had to be taken into account. We started doing digital hearings a few weeks after COVID, and we operated in a system then, VScene. VScene was probably the worst introduction for panel members it could have been. VScene had lots of technical glitches. I won't dwell on it too long, but it was extremely stressful at that time for the panel community to get them up to speed. Bear in mind their lack of knowledge of how this was going to work, their experience of ever having conducted any form of hearing on screen, and it was a stressful time for everybody, very, very stressful indeed. Once we moved off VScene, things became significantly better, but for many panel members, they didn't feel comfortable at all actually having a panel situation in their own home, and they felt that was far too stressful for many of them as well, never mind the digital issues around that too, because they were bringing the problems of others into their home and the issues around confidentiality when the family were all working at home at that time as well.
Thank you. Mrs. Young, in terms of, Mr. King's obviously mentioned there some of the difficulties that were experienced. Did you experience any difficulties in terms of the, I suppose, the substantive content of dealing with hearings when you were dealing?
Personally, like everybody, I think, found it was a whole new landscape. It was a whole different context in which you were conducting hearings. And I think, in one sense, it was the task that was before us was the same as it has always been, that we were there to make decisions about whether or not compulsory measures of care were necessary for whichever child's hearing it was. But because the context was different, managing such a hearing became a completely different task, which was unfamiliar. So, like Mr. King says, it was very stressful. And in my role as a lead panel representative, it fell to me to assist, support, look to the pastoral care needs of the other 89 panel members that were currently, at that time, serving in West Lothian. And as Mr. King has said, there was quite variety, and I think I was very, very impressed by the support I then received from my colleagues, that when I asked if they were able to do it, all 90 panel members said, yes, I would want to do this, it is important. About 10 could not, for all the reasons that have been rehearsed, I'm sure, in other contexts about the pandemic, whether that was not having a private space, not having an adequate Wi-Fi signal, not having the technical equipment, or people who were key workers and could not give the time to do it, or people who were trying to save their businesses. So there were a number of reasons, but we had 80 people who said to me, I'm willing to give it a go. It's important. So that was really very, very encouraging to me, and we found various ways to support each other in this new landscape. And I think I personally never had any difficulty in having panel members willing to sit on any hearing that we were asked to conduct in West Lothian throughout the pandemic.
Did you find, in terms of your engagement with the participants in hearings, did you find that was different? Did people engage in a different way, or did you struggle to hear them? I mean, were there any differences in terms of that?
Well, at different stages, all of those things are true. I think initially we did not have very many people who could have attended actually attending because of the difficulties they had in terms of perhaps being digitally excluded. Sometimes we couldn't even have the social worker to give us an up-to-date recent impression of the situation. As time went on, that improved, and as we moved from VScene into Teams, it improved significantly. And I think it was a very level playing field, because whether it was ourselves as panel members, whether it was the reporters, whether it was professionals, whether it was family members, this was something new, and there was almost that sense that we were exploring how to make this work together. But that said, I think there were a number of things that would strike any of us, that there were individuals who perhaps, because they were in their safe space, spoke differently towards panel members. But the thing that, in a positive way, I think, that struck me particularly was that for the children that I saw, and I actually saw a lot of children throughout the course of the pandemic, it was very evident that they were in their own safe space. I had one child who was clearly feeling they were in a safe space and was almost oversharing information that concerned me, that there were people who might have sought to use that in ways that we wouldn't have wanted. But as a really clear illustration, perhaps, for the inquiry, remember a family sitting on a sofa, sharing a telephone screen, and the child in question somersaulting past the screen and going, no, it didn't happen like that. What happened was this. So actually there was an opening up by some people to be almost more honestly sharing, because they were in their safe space. They had not, for all the relative informality that we try to achieve in hearings, where these children were in their own sitting room. And you really did feel this was one occasion you had definitely got that child's views.
Ms. Christie, did you find any differences in terms of the participation of families and children in your experience?
Yes, a lot of what Sarah had said, I would concur with. You got a lot of very open conversations with families. I think at that point it was almost everybody was equal. Nobody was at that point, you know, it wasn't social worker versus family or panel versus family. It was, you know, the family were in essence untouchable. They weren't getting berated because their children weren't going to school. They weren't getting into difficulties because they weren't letting social work into their home. So it almost sort of took the pressure off in some ways, you know, and they became much more engaged in the process to try and sort of figure out, you know, and listen. There was a lot of anger, there was a lot of upset, especially around the family time, about parents being able to see their children. But I think for me that was completely understandable. You know, you know, if your child was in care and was perhaps on the edge of being returned to you, but that process couldn't be followed through because of the pandemic, and you then were not allowed to see your child at all, or perhaps, you know, 10 minutes outside in a park, you know, that is absolutely heartbreaking and would make anybody angry and upset. So you know, you had to accept that. In the very beginning, we didn't have any additional functions as to exclude people or to kind of silence their microphones, etc. So we just had to take it. We just had to listen to everything that they wanted to say and more. And that could be really difficult at times, especially when parents were crying and they were upset, and you just felt a bit helpless, really. Because there was you knew there was nothing you could do, and you always want, as a panel member, you always want to leave a family in a better place than when you found them, if you like. And that was kind of sometimes impossible during the pandemic because the options just weren't there for us.
Thank you. Mr. King, you've mentioned a number of the difficulties that panel members are experiencing in terms, at least at the outset, in terms of the digital provision. In your experience, did Children's Hearing Scotland lose panel members in consequence of those difficulties?
We lost a lot of panel members during the period in time we're talking about here from 2020 to 2022. I think we've alluded to some of the reasons today already in terms of their occupations, their time to reflect on their commitment, their concentration and attitude maybe to their own family and how much time they had to give to their own family, their own pressures at work. And I think a lot of people evaluated it, but we did lose a lot of panel members. And in fact, we had the biggest recruitment in 2021 to try and rebalance the panel community at that time, which involved quite a lot of work, particularly for everybody.
You've mentioned there people's individual circumstances. I just wondered whether you were aware of anyone who, I suppose, wasn't able to make the transition. Were there panel members who simply weren't able to adapt to that new situation?
A lot of them weren't comfortable with it. I think that would be fair to say. But also a lot of them gave their time and were devoted to doing their very best for children and families. And we spent a long time coaching them to try and make them comfortable. I would say, you know, the minority maybe walked away, but the majority stuck with it. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, when VScene was the bit that tested them all to destruction almost. But once we moved on to Teams, they could see the benefits of the new system and how that it was much more stable and able to hold a hearing to some degree of what they were used to in the past as well. But the most important thing was to make sure we didn't let anything lapse for the children and families. And that was vitally important during the COVID period as well, that we certainly had to make sure the children that needed orders were protected, and that drove a lot of the panel members to carry on.
Thank you. I'd like to talk to you now. We've heard from Mr. Jackson this morning about the legislative changes that were made, and a number of those obviously made life easier in terms of administratively for Children's Hearing Scotland. But I'd like to, if I may, just to examine those with you and hear your view in terms of the impacts of those, both in terms of your work, but also in terms of the work of the hearings in terms of its other participants, the children and others. And if I could start, Mrs. Young, the change to the obligation for a child or a young person to attend a hearing, that was suspended during the course of the pandemic. I wonder if you had any views on that.
Well, fundamentally, I think the children's hearing system is a very good system because it puts the child at the heart and it gives them the right to speak for themselves. And that, for me, has always been a key element, important, positive element. So if you remove their obligation, does that then mean that fewer come? I think that is a hard question to answer because many did not attend hearings throughout the pandemic because there was no opportunity to do so when we were fully digital. As things progressed, people were, between lockdowns, able to attend at hearing centres. But I think the thing that concerned me at the time was if you remove the obligation, I think that is good because it speeds up the processes at the hearing. We don't have to consider whether we can excuse the child and so on. But I'm not entirely convinced that it didn't provide an easy route to saying, it's okay, you don't need to come. And in that, were the children receiving a disservice in that their opportunity to speak for themselves was removed. So there's a fundamental thing there. But actually, in terms of the COVID situation at the time, I think it probably made for hearings to be a little bit more quickly conducted and so on. And given that connectivity, as we still experience today, issues were very prevalent, I think that was a sensible short-term solution.
Ms. Christie, first of all, do you share that view? And secondly, in your experience, did the change materially affect the numbers of children that you were seeing at hearings?
Yeah, I would say I agree with Sarah. I think it's a difficult one to balance. I think, you know, children have a right and a duty to attend their hearings. To remove that completely perhaps takes the pressure off them. But during the pandemic, I would say I probably saw far more children on screen than I have ever seen in person. They quite liked the interaction. It was nice to sort of engage with them. I think they were maybe just looking for something different to do. So they were happy to sort of come along, join the hearing. They could go back to their bedroom. They could come back to the screen. You know, it was just a much nicer environment for them to participate, I would say.
Thank you. Mr. King, do you think there's any other mechanisms or ways that children's participation or children's communication, I suppose, with panel members could be implemented?
I think we do ask them to fill in their own feedback form that they can submit to a panel. They can actually work with, say, if they're a guidance teacher, if they're at school in normal times. And I think one thing we have to think about going forward is via the safeguarders that we appoint to and to get their views, and also via perhaps using technology today, not available maybe then, to actually get video recordings of children's views, and they can be played back in a hearing room. And we should open all these avenues up to make sure we hear the voice of the child much more. And in fact, I think, I'll stand corrected in this, but I think we only see about 30% of children in Scotland at hearings. It will vary from area to area. And if we see a child in person, it makes such a huge difference, as I'm sure my fellow panel members sitting beside me here today will say.
I'll continue with you, Mr. King, if I may. Two of the other changes that were made were extensions of time limits. First of all, in respect of compulsory supervision order reviews extended by 6 months from 12 to 18 months. And the second was in respect of interim supervision orders, again, doubled in that case from 22 days to 44 days. Are you able to offer His Lordship any view in terms of the merits of those changes and the effects that they had on the hearings?
Yes. Well, in the extension of the compulsory supervision order for 6 months, that made a lot of common sense because a number of the orders contain certain measures and conditions of attendance at school, etc. And obviously they weren't valid during the lockdown period particularly, and also other measures within compulsory supervision orders couldn't be measured because of the impact of the lockdown at that time. I think for cases that were new and coming into the system, having the interim orders extended from 22 to 44 days took an immense pressure off the system, because if grounds were not accepted, the grounds would have to go to the sheriff. The sheriffs were under their own pressures, and also any measures that we put in an interim order to measure the success or evaluate the success of it, it became more difficult because of contact measures and restrictions that the other professional workers were trying to do. And in fact, I think you could safely say today we wish we still had the 44-day option on our interim orders, because I certainly, as a panel member, and I'll let my other two panel members comment if they wish to, actually welcome that. And hearings are stressful, and I think that's the point I want to make. Hearings are stressful for children and families, and unless something's needing to change, why put them through the stress again? And 22 to 44 days was a very good move, and it probably arguably should still be with us today.
Mrs. Young, notwithstanding the extensions, in your experience, did you find that cases were coming back before the hearings within the normal timeframes, or were the full extended periods being used?
I think largely the full extended period was being used, especially initially, but I think as we became more aware of the ways in which this additional time extension could be operated, that it became a very useful piece of legislation, because some things require assessment, and it would sort of align with assessment periods better, and we could extend, say, to 36 days. It might not use the full 44 days. I think there was initially very much, oh, we can extend it to 44 days, so that's what we have to do. But then there was a growing understanding of how this could be used to actually really benefit progress for the child in what was a very difficult landscape in which to progress anything, with the lockdowns and the limitations on the times when children saw their families, if they were away from home, and so on and so forth.
Did you come across any situations where you felt children, or indeed their families, were negatively affected by these kinds of extensions?
I'm not aware directly. I think that's a very hard one for us as panel members to answer, because we're not necessarily sitting on the deferred case those 36, 44 days later. So that was I think that's quite a difficult one to honestly assess.
Did you come across any circumstances where I suppose people may have remained in the system longer than they might otherwise?
No, I don't think I did. I can certainly recall one or two older young people actually requesting to remain on an order, which may seem almost bizarre, but actually asking to remain, just because they were feeling the benefit, and I suppose they were in a, these are people who have had trauma in their past. And so I think this sudden and rapid change and the landscape looking different, the context for them being different, that they actually felt perhaps some degree of safety from having that order in place.
Ms Christie, two of the other changes, if I may again bundle them, affected the composition of the panel, or panels, in that there was the removal of the gender balance requirement and the removal of the requirement for 3 panel members. Do you have any view on the impact or merits of those decisions?
I think the gender balance one should have always have been in place. I think it doesn't matter what your gender is. If you have the experience, you have the knowledge and the qualifications to kind of be sitting on a panel, that's where you should be. It doesn't matter what your gender is. I think for me as a panel member, I found it quite strange the first time I sat on an all-female panel. It was quite different. So from a personal point of view, I did notice the difference. I don't think families noticed the difference. I don't think nobody commented on it. I think perhaps at some points I would say, so we've got an all-female panel today. This is allowed under the kind of COVID regulations. But that was probably me, I think, just feeling it was different and feeling the need to explain it to families, I think, more than families noticing it. So that side of it, I don't think was hugely different. It was still 3 panel members. We proceeded in exactly the same way that we would, so the gender didn't make any difference. Operating with 2 panel members, or sometimes with 1, which thankfully I don't think I was ever in that position, that I think was quite troublesome, because you do very much depend on your fellow panel members for their input and for their questioning, and I would have, when I was in that position, I would always have tried to sort of reconnect and summarise and, wait for somebody to come back, and only when it got to a point where it was clearly obvious that wasn't going to happen would we proceed. It did feel to me a little bit unfair, because you weren't getting the same input from 3 people, and although it is a majority that carries, so 2 people make the same decision, that is the decision made. Just having 2 people decide, if there is a difference, then it becomes a bit more difficult to manage. So I think that wasn't ideal, and I certainly wouldn't like that to be the case going forward. I don't think that would work very well. But certainly from my experience, I was only in that position a couple of times, thankfully. From a family's perspective, I would imagine it would seem very unfair, because they would possibly be hanging on to the hope that somebody might have said something different. So that would, why it wasn't really ideal, I don't think.
Did you feel any additional pressure when you were sitting as a panel of 2 as opposed to a panel of 3?
Yes. Yeah, I would say definitely yes. Yeah. It's always a pressure to sort of make the decision that you think is the right decision, but to not have that sort of third person sort of back you up, I found it incredibly more stressful, yeah. Mr.
King, it may be implicit that getting 2 is easier than getting 3. You have experience of, with others on the panel, have experience of rota management for panel members. Could you tell His Lordship how you found that during the pandemic?
Very stressful, I think, would be the simple solution. And that wasn't anybody's fault, I have to stress. And I'm sure people will recognise during the pandemic, people were falling down with the COVID virus without a lot of notice, and we had to change panels at very short notice. And we were on call 7 days a week because invariably something would happen over the weekend where we'd have to substitute a panel member, or we'd have to take a telephone call from a panel member Sunday afternoon to say, I don't feel very well today and I'm not sure about tomorrow morning for my panel. And, you know, I used to have this detailed conversation about, well, do you think you'll be able to manage it? You know, or do you not think you'll be able to manage it? And it's a very sensitive conversation because you're getting into people's health and personal circumstances. And, you know, eventually you have to say sometimes, make the decision, I'll remove you now Sunday afternoon, but I needed to find somebody else on Sunday afternoon to fill that space. And that was quite a long period of notice. 8 o'clock on Monday morning, the same thing happens. 8:30 on Monday morning, and you know there's a panel needed for 9 o'clock on Monday morning, and that panel has to go ahead. So we had tremendous cooperation from panel members who would step into a panel at very short notice. They'd get a briefing from the other two panel members outlining the basics of the case and be able to make good and sound decisions based on what the fellow two panel members have said and what would be said, you know, during the hearing. But it was a tough time. You know, we're changing panel members frequently, right up to hearings, and we did our very best. And every hearing was covered, and every hearing went ahead. As Sue Christie said, sometimes you lost a panel member during a hearing for connectivity issues, but when we started with 3, usually we finished with 3.
We heard from Mr. Jackson this morning that I think probably pre the Children's Hearing Scotland organisation panels would have been very localised, and with Children's Scotland we have more of a national viewpoint, albeit people still tend to sit within their local areas. During the pandemic, Mrs. Young, did you find, or are you aware of circumstances of greater involvement out with your local area by any chance?
Yes. As I've said earlier, that we were very fortunate in West Lothian. I had 80 panel members to call on to man hearings, and we had a very much reduced workload in terms of the number of hearings. So unlike many other areas in Scotland, I had the difficulty that I had more panel members who would like to have sat on a hearing than we had hearings to be manned. And we were alerted to the fact that there were a number of areas who were really struggling to get panels together to hear the hearings that were required. And we set up an arrangement whereby anyone in West Lothian could sit on hearings in these areas that were particularly in need. And I did do that. We made arrangements and interacted to make sure their hearings were covered. And again, that could be last minute. And I sat on hearings in these areas, and I was very struck by the fact that I was managing to not sit on an excessive number of hearings through and this is right through the pandemic, but I was sitting with colleagues who were saying, oh, thank you, you can chair. I have sat on 5 sessions in the last week, and I sat on 4 sessions the week before. I was coming up against people who were exhausted, but their commitment was second to none, and they were willing to do it. So that was a case in point. That was responding in terms of to the emergency. We then set up a system whereby, I suppose you'd effectively say, I loaned another area in a pre-planned way, panel members to sit on their rota. And that was done on a very regular basis throughout. Really, all of this was from about June, July of 2020 to right the way through to into end of 22. And again, we were met with, thank goodness you're here, because the one particular area where we were pre-planning it, they were very, very short of people who were able to chair, and without that additional support and help, it was going to prove too much for the limited number of personnel that they could make available. And that, I think, set out that it was very possible for panel members to sit across the country, and that became more and more the practice and has been developed into a very much more of a national panel able to come in and assist where necessary, and I think that has been a real benefit in the longer term.
Ms Christie, I mean, during the pandemic, in your experience, or indeed your experience of other panel members, I mean, were people sitting on more panels than they would ordinarily?
Yeah, I mean, I was working through the pandemic as well myself, and yeah, I would say I was certainly doing panels weekly, if not twice weekly, sometimes more than that. You know, if you know, Jack would phone at 8:30 on a Monday morning and say, you know, can you cover this panel this afternoon? And then you have to do your preparation as much as you can. So, yeah, definitely sitting on far more than I had ever experienced before.
If I could just come in on that and say we had a nucleus of panel members like Sue who did excessive hearings, and Sarah has alluded to it, we had about 10 or 15 panel members who were sitting as often as we could allow them to sit to keep the system functioning. So they gave a lot of time and effort and very professional in doing it as well.
I mean, Mrs Young, picking up on what Mr King's saying there, I mean, what sort of hours are panel members working? Bearing in mind they're volunteers.
Yeah, the volunteers. Well, I think, as I've already explained, that in a way that in West Lothian we were in a probably unique situation for whatever reason, that I had more people to call on. So we were not being excessively asked. I mean, the normal expectation would be that a panel member would sit on hearings on 2 occasions in any given month. And I was pleased that I was achieving that for those panel members who were making themselves available. There were occasions, and particularly at the very early stages, where, again, like has been mentioned, we were sitting on hearings every week, but we built up our core sort of group of people so that we had so many to call upon. So for me, there was not a huge amount of extra in terms of the number of hours that individual panel members were giving, but I think for those people who were in the supportive roles and doing things like the rota management and ensuring that the well-being of these panel members was such that they could continue, the hours they would be seen as excessive if it was your full-time job. And I know I'm not unique in this, but I do recall at 11 o'clock at night having a phone call from a panel member who was doing preparation for a hearing and wanting to talk about not just what the options for them might be, but how it would work under this new system. And then, 7:30 the following morning, another panel member's phoning to say they can't actually do that because they've just tested positive for COVID. If it was later on, they were obviously having to excuse themselves if they'd been scheduled to be in person once we could do in-person hearings. So the number of hours that and some people were doing was, I mean, I don't know how to quantify it, but it was a much more than a full-time paid employment would expect.
Did you find a similar experience in Edinburgh, Mr King?
Absolutely. It was 7 days a week. You were never off duty, and you had to be available, to speak to your panel members. They were doing their best as well. Nobody wanted to be ill. Nobody wanted to go down with the COVID virus. No, if people didn't understand papers or a problem with technology, they needed help and support, you had to be there to help and support them. And Sunday was quite often the busiest day of the week sometimes because there was nobody else for them to turn to. And, they wanted to do the hearings. They weren't wanting to not do them, but they needed a bit of help and support, and you always had to be there to help them at any time, whatever time of the day or night.
Ms Christie, we've spoken about the pressures on panel members and the fact that for various reasons, some panel members couldn't continue during the pandemic. We've also mentioned there was a huge recruitment drive over that period. Were you involved with recruitment?
Yes.
And what was your experience of that?
So as part of the area support team, I was involved with interviewing. So that was, again, we did that remotely, so that was a new experience. I think that was probably my first experience of interviewing as part of the area support team. So I think for me, it was a bit double-edged because I hadn't experienced it before, so I didn't know what it was like previously. So this was the new setup, and that was my first experience. So the interviewing process, I think, was quite straightforward. That was okay. But when we got to you will recruit your panel members, and then the Learning Academy will take over, and they will allocate them training dates and training places, etc. They'll go through their pre-service training, and then almost you get them back at that point once they're qualified, they've been signed off or appointed. I think for me at that point, because there was such a high number, and the way it had been decided to be done was to not keep them in their areas. So everybody, all the new recruits, were not with Edinburgh people, they were with people from all over of Scotland. So they didn't really have an opportunity to build up a cohort, a peer group, etc. So we tried to install that from our end. So we spent a lot of time doing drop-ins and kind of Teams meetings and trying to organise people into groups so they could get to know each other from Edinburgh. But it was difficult because people were unhappy with the training they were getting. It was all virtual, there was lots of gaps. So you spent a lot of time sort of going over that. And you know, when you're trying to be supportive and work through things. And I had, although the recruitment side of it wasn't really 100%, obviously, or was not 100% for me to do, the support side of it was for the new panel members. So I recruited some fellow panel members to help me with that, so it wasn't just all on me, which worked really well as well.
Mr. King, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you were a facilitator in the Learning Academy, is that correct?
Yes, I was a facilitator, and I took a number of groups through the initial training programme during the period in question.
Could you tell us about that? And in particular, I suppose, what differences there were between that and the pre or post-pandemic period?
Well, pre-pandemic, all training was done face-to-face. It was done over 7 days. And there's lots of role plays and lots of exercises in that, and there was also a lot of support because some of the training brings out some issues that panel members have experienced, particularly around trauma, etc. And there was always support on hand to help and support them when it's face to face. When you're doing it remote, it was reduced from 7 days to 4 days, and that started at just after 9 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday and finished about 4:30 on a Saturday, but it was all done online. And it's extremely difficult to try and keep everybody's motivation and concentration, however hard we all tried with breaks and light relief at times to try and make the sessions less stressful for people. But to spend 4 days online, not continuously I might add, and there was very little availability support in between the training too, that because of the restrictions and COVID. So I think it did have an effect on a number of people, and we lost a significant number of the new trainees who felt they hadn't had the right support, help and encouragement, however hard we tried at that time. And, you know, they welcomed actually building up relationships and staying with us when they could get back to face, the ones that stayed. But it was very difficult to train people from one model to a new virtual remote model.
Do new panel members have much of an opportunity to be exposed to panel hearings before they're sitting on them?
Is that to me? Yes.
Yes.
They do. I can only speak from Edinburgh, but every Edinburgh trainee panel member had an opportunity at least to sit in 2 face-to-face panels as an observer, and usually we try to fit them into a virtual one as well, so that the experience of doing that. Other areas might operate differently, but if we always let them sit in another panel for some reason, if they wanted to get a bit more experience and confidence, because every panel is different, and it's important that they saw a variety of hearings, and that complemented their training programme, and more importantly, it got them engaging with panel members and chatting to panel members in between the hearings, and also they got to listen to the pre-hearing discussion. They got a chance to discuss and see a chair operating a hearing, and the post-panel review of the hearing and understanding what was involved after the hearing to record the reasons. And it was very, very beneficial it is very, very beneficial today for all panel members.
Was there any differences in terms of that opportunity to observe during the pandemic?
Yes, there was, because we had to have restrictions on the number of people in the rooms. We were fortunate in Edinburgh with a very, very big hearing room that we could use, but even then there was restrictions like everywhere else in the spacing and having people within the room. So a lot of the observations were done virtually rather than face-to-face. So you missed out on that bit of listening beforehand, chatting afterwards. It wasn't as easy online as it would be face-to-face, but they still had an opportunity to see some form of hearings, even if it was just online.
Time flies and we're coming towards the end of our time. I just have one further set of questions which I'm going to ask. After that, I'm going to come and give you an opportunity, if you'd like, if there's anything else that we've not had an opportunity to touch upon, or particular things that you think His Lordship might want to hear, or particular lessons potentially that His Lordship might want to consider in terms of his reporting, then we'll have an opportunity to do that. But before I do that, Mrs. Young, could I just ask you about, I suppose, the well-being of panel members? How do you feel panel members coped during the pandemic, and how do you feel they were supported both by their peers and by Children's Hearing Scotland?
I think because of the nature of being a panel member, there are occasions when the work itself is potentially very traumatic, or it is a reminder of traumatic events in an individual's past. So well-being support was well developed before the pandemic, and I think panel members were not entirely good at coming forward themselves in seeking help. I think actually since the pandemic that has improved quite noticeably. Possibly one of the things from COVID is that we have all become much more aware of our own well-being. And I think it came to light just how effective many of our support systems were, and those have been perhaps more fully adopted and developed post-pandemic. So I think those things have been particularly good. Again, I think, as I said in reference earlier, that we were in a fortunate position that we were asking people to go out of their comfort zones significantly and learn new things, but we were not overloading them with these distressing situations. So, but in other areas, it was really obvious. We may have been online. It may be more difficult to pick up body language, but it was very evident there were some people who, were really experiencing quite a lot of difficulty and just trying to keep going. So it did have a significant impact, but I think panel members are a fairly resilient group, and I think the fact that we are all very committed to what we're doing and could see that there is still a difference being made. I mean, in a way, there are occasions which every panel member has come across on occasions where you know that you have put an order in place that has actually kept a child's life safe. And I think that because you can have that effect and that impact, that is helpful in terms of one's own well-being. So I think we were all stretched. It was difficult. And there were extra pressures. I mean, you know, I was a shielded individual, and I think this is not unique to the hearing system. I think that was not well understood. You know, I appear to be a very healthy, fine, active individual. That wasn't perhaps the perception of people who were in the shielding position, and it was remarkable how often I had to explain what that meant. But it also made supporting other people who were in that position feel that they were supported because they knew somebody else understood the complexities of that.
Thank you. Ms Christie, in offering this opportunity, if I could come to you first, if there's anything that you'd like to raise at this time.
Yeah, I think for me, a phrase we hear quite often in the children's hearing system is good enough. We wasn't something that we heard an awful lot before COVID, but now I'm hearing it more and more, where the level of care is good enough, the home conditions are good enough, the parenting capacity is good enough. And I think we can do better than that. We can do so much better than that for our children. And it sort of goes back to some panel member as well. We have a legacy of some panel members who have been recruited on the short-term training courses who, again, are good enough. But it's not good enough. You know, we should be, at the very least, aiming for good, not good enough.
Thank you. Mr King, if I could come to you next. Is there anything you'd like to raise with His Lordship before we close?
Well, I think what I'd like His Lordship and to be recorded is that Children's Hearing Scotland gave us a lot of help and support from a high level, and I was very fortunate I worked hand in hand with a very good area convener. But I think we were just one of 22 ASTs, and throughout Scotland, you know, the time and dedication, support and help that everybody gave to keep the system functioning cannot be underestimated. We've talked already today of the time and commitment, but it's the passion people have to do their very best for children. It didn't maybe work as well as it could at times, but we kept going, we kept working through it, we kept adapting and learned a lot of new skills. And if this happened again tomorrow, and nobody would wish that, I think we'd be in a far better position than we were in March 2020. And we all have developed going through the system, and we've all got new skills as well. I think it's important we continue to move forward at all times for the benefit of the children and families that we are trying to do our very best for.
Thank you. And finally, Mrs Young, if there's anything else that you would like to raise?
No, I think it's very much on the same sort of lines. I think there were a lot of difficulties, and there were a lot of things that we, at the time, were not happy about and could have been done better. But I think the pandemic showed us new ways of working that have been beneficial to those people that we aim to serve. I think it was the support. I think we should recognise the support that us as panel members were given by Children's Hearing Scotland. They have often been accused of being very remote or out of touch, but I think like us as panel members or in leadership roles within the hearing system, they also had at Children's Hearing Scotland to kind of flip where their focus was. There was a very good system of delegation for support of panel members and for making the job happen. But they had to then directly get involved with that, which was a new challenge for them, which was very much risen to, negotiating with Scottish Government, getting new legislation in very quickly, and panel members responded to that, and we benefited from that. And I think, as Mr King has said, there are things that we are now doing differently, and would prepare us better were we faced with such a similar challenge. But I think the system has got many new benefits, but we can always do better.
Thank you very much. My Lord, I have no further questions for these witnesses, and subject to some brief closing remarks, my Lord, that is all the witnesses I intend to call.
Very good. I'm going to ask you to stay for a few minutes because Mr. Turner, as you perhaps know, I don't know, is going to make some closing remarks of a technical nature. I apologise for detaining you any longer than I have to. I'll thank you formally after Mr. Turner has made his remarks.
Obliged, my Lord.
When you're ready, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, my Lord. My Lord, as I said, that brings the current block of justice hearings to an end. With your Lordship's indulgence, I just have some minor procedural matters I wish to address with your Lordship before we close today's proceedings. The first, my Lord, is just to note, as your Lordship is aware, we do have one witness from the Justice Impact hearings who was scheduled to appear during the current block, but was unable to do so for reasons beyond both the inquiry and indeed the witness's control. It's been agreed that time will be afforded for that witness to give evidence during the week currently set aside for the worship and life events hearings due to take place between the 29th of April and the 2nd of May 2025.
Very good.
The session for that remaining witness, that remaining justice witness, has provisionally been set for the afternoon of the 2nd of May. Your Lordship has determined that court participants with leave to appear for the current block of justice hearings will, without further application, be given leave to appear in respect of that witness session.
Of course.
The inquiry will, in due course, confirm and publish a timetable for that session, along with the timetable for the other hearings scheduled for the week of the worship and life events hearings. With respect to closing statements, my Lord, further to my comments in opening the current block of hearings, your Lordship has now determined in principle that closing statements will, as previously indicated, be invited to be given in writing by co-participants with leave to appear. The timing of those statements will be notified in due course, and that will, of course, allow for the final justice witness to be heard in advance of that.
Quite.
Following completion of the Justice Impact hearing witnesses in May, the inquiry intends to produce a narrative record of the evidence relating to justice that has been gathered. Co-participants with leave to appear may be offered the opportunity to comment thereupon before publication. The timing and a decision in that regard in respect of that report will be provided in due course, and again will follow on from any timing of the closing statements. Just one more remark, I suppose, my Lord. In closing, I just wish to give a word of thanks to all the witnesses who have given their time freely and without whom the inquiry could not have undertaken its work in this block of hearings, and also to say a personal thanks to the inquiry team who've contributed to the success of these justice hearings. Those are my closing remarks, my Lord, unless I can assist your Lordship.
No, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Turner. All that remains for me to say is to give some thanks as well. Thank you to you, Mr. Turner, for leading this part of the hearings so capably. Also to all your council team and all the solicitors that were involved and all the ancillary staff that put together the hearings and so forth. I'd like to thank the witnesses as well. It remains to thank you three. Thank you very much indeed for your evidence today. Can I also say, by way of passing, that you made the point, I think all of you made the point at certain times, that you're slightly unique, or slightly unusual, in that you are a cohort of volunteers, whereas most of the other people, who no doubt are very willing, able and enthusiastic, get paid for it, but you do it voluntarily. That is to be commended and is noted, you will be glad to hear. I, of course, in the previous incarnation of my professional career, dealt frequently with at least matters that emanated from the children's panels, so I have no hesitation in saying they do a very, very good job and are to be praised for it. I'm very grateful for your evidence. That's all until I think the, 18th April?
29th of April.
29th of April. I never get dates right. Thank you very much.